When we think of the ever-continued presence of Disney franchises, the one that really sticks out the most that has to be desired is The Incredibles, one that has been disappointing with its latest content to say the least, with how many times we look back on The Incredibles 2 with such disappointment. Not a bad film, but just like some of the other sequels, vastly downgraded from its entire message and the story with its very themes. And that's a problem we have to factor with the behind-the-scenes information with what really was desired for the film or its subsequent potential follow-up with what the sequel could do, which is what this video is meant to address, in the interesting question if an Incredibles 3 can work, or some sort of series connected with the Incredibles in what we know about supers of their very universe, which is part of an idea that others like Samuel Jackson had brought up for Frozone and Mr. Incredible in their adventures in the early days that we explored in the first and second. All interesting ideas, but how it is a complicated path moving forward in terms of the overall problems with these sequels and most franchises in general. But again, this is just a world that has such an interest to continue with the concept of supers in society and their interactions with our daily, regular lives. Because the real story of this very universe was that of the family dynamic and how important that really was, using the elements of supers to really elevate that individually, what it actually meant individually to a person and his struggle to find his place in the world, or worlds if you think about what that pertains to. Because mentioning more about The Incredibles 2 is where we learned that Brad Bird acknowledged the film's production schedule resulted in many plot lines and ideas he had for the film being cut from the final version due to Toy Story 4 that was moved a year ahead of schedule, while this film was moved a year before. Where it is my greater understanding that this happened because of how Marvel was at its peak in 2018 before Endgame was released a year later alongside Toy Story 4. That Disney wanted to have this scheduled during its highest peak of superhero popularity because that's what the original did succeed at doing during its early beginnings before it exploded, being recognized by people like me as the greatest superhero movie of all time. Because Brad also said, quote, "They took a year off our schedule, so if an idea didn't work quickly, you had to just kill that darling off and move on to the next. And I killed a city full of darlings." Which is funny he said that because Edna says darling a lot and he did voice Edna, where the main thing to take away from this quote was that like every other Disney sequel, it was just rushed down a conveyor belt too fast to even be finished. I mean, sure, you might say this might have been in the works for 14 years, which is a very long time for an expected sequel that we all anticipated for, but sometimes the actual process is much more closer to the date than you actually think, which causes certain ideas to be shifted while focusing on the main storylines of Elastigirl and Mr. Incredible's familial roles. The problem where seeing some of the deleted scenes would have actually made the film more better and more impactful than the final forgettable film. Not saying all, but a lot of great ideas that Brad liked would have actually gone a long way in the film instead. One scene to highlight out of this problem would be the eulogy for Gazerbeam and all the other supers that were killed under Syndrome during their time of hiding, setting us the world of what happened ever since supers were forced to go underground and what it meant for the Incredibles to fight and why it makes them who they are as anyone else with or without powers. The same message that was reiterated in the first by Dash and Buddy, that when everyone was the same, nothing different was ever gained. A major idea also straightened by another scene showcasing the kids stopping a robbery without Bob's help at all, showing that they also can do it since they have powers ever since the end of the first, acting more as a family to solve the public crisis in the message of what this movie should have brought in the first place. Yes, it still has that in the final film, but it just didn't seem as strong because it focused a lot on this comedy aspect and not enough on the drama or the adult themes that were brought up in the first. Where scenes like this were all scenes that Brad said he liked, but were just not there in the final product as that did not fit with the rushed schedule, mainly because of that Toy Story schedule change rather than an overall problem that didn't fit the story because they didn't have time to figure it out at all. But thinking in terms of that ending, that was all solved anyway because that was still the basis of the movie, trying to make them legal to do what they needed to do as supers in this new future with their return. Like when you realize that message, what can you do with that film if it actually happens, or in Disney's case, of course, when it is actually announced? Do you actually continue the same family dynamic as the first two that tried to keep them in the same time period, or do you actually age the kids up a bit and to explore a newer generation? These are just very interesting concepts that of course need time to shape up for something great to come that wasn't the case at all within the second film. But compared to the other films, I still remain open to this one one the most because of the world they actually made around it. It just offers so many unique aspects to it that have yet to be explored in the ever-changing presence of life and learning to live after your time. From how Bob was still free at the very beginning to being married and having kids and balancing all of those parts in his life, learning to grow as a father and whatnot that pertains to that. Where you enter the third chapter in a world that has gained what was already lost in the first, where you have to see what happens in this stage in life. One that might have to do with aging up the kids in this time, with Violet graduating high school or in college and Dash entering in that era. More about their own responsibilities growing up as people in the world and how Jack also fits into that. Where we also have to note the reason why they were the same age in the sequel was to fit the family story of each person's role that coincides with their powers, like a baby being chaos incarnate, the teen being invisible, and the boy being hyper wanting to do the next thing the fastest. All of which are a great focus while the parents settle down a bit for what they actually both worked to achieve in their lives in the first two, both in the swap roles in managing the family and fighting for their own glory days, where it's officially time they let their kids take the reign while they go on their next adventure. Of course, this also means we also have to find room for a great villain once again, which was also the biggest letdown of the last movie, letting the Underminer escape scot-free as a side piece character, and then Evelyn Dever being the main twist controlling Screenslaver because she was just bitter her parents died since supers were made illegal, and is trying hard to keep it that way while also somehow helping her brother help Elastigirl make it legal still, as that made total sense somehow. Because the Screenslaver was actually a late creation in a shorter production schedule, as they needed time to figure out how they counteract the actions of the supers as much as Syndrome did in his own way at first, as a reaction that society had to them. Where the original versions of the second film dealt with this more artificial intelligence driven plot, which would have made more sense with the tech that was being used to stop the supers and the public opinion to make them legal, something that still works well with what has happened in the world today with technology, which seems worthy to continue off of Syndrome, who is smart enough to actually stop most of them. That another element of this world is how you would actually have to have a good villain to contrast with the message and the actions performed by its main characters. What was shaped to get them to this point that made them more than just a villain that goes against the supers more than the on the daily type stick. From the very first film, it was very clear what was wanted to be told by how the actions do have consequences, where the smallest impact can actually last the longest amount of time, affecting something or someone in a particular fashion, where it's up to them to decide how to use it. Where they cannot continue with a straight and narrow path regarding its story, as that's the reason why these modern sequels just don't work so well, where it needs to exist if a good idea is within reason. What the nature of life usually tells and how that can apply to a super and a non-super, which also could actually be a good plot, turning a former hero into a villain for an incredible story to see how some individuals and some families can drift apart, reminding us constantly of the ever-present importance of still having such. I mean, that was at least something explored further with the Devers more than Syndrome, but still needed more time since Screenslaver was still a late deciding factor. But the main thing to take away from such an idea, and this entire video as a whole, is that this should only happen if you have a good idea from it. Something similar to how Cars 3 was generally a good sequel to Cars after what happened to the second, because it still had something relevant to tell to the world. And also if Brad Bird was willing to finally tell such a thing after taking another break to tell his other stories, while also acknowledging the environment for sequels being pretty rough, consisting of us who either don't or do want it, whether it be a studio needing it to make profits, or fans who want it, or critical disasters that everyone just scorns with complete laziness. That we needed to feel passionate with a great story that can live on for generations no matter how good or bad the animation could age or other factors with it. That we know beyond our own limited concept of time and the eternity that awaits us. And of course, to see what happens in this new year that is consisted of mostly animated sequels, as the only thing most major studios know how to do anyway. But what will be the most telling is the wait and see of the next generation of these Disney Pixar films, that to see if that staying power will hold, if such potential can still be desired or shown by a creative and passionate team, or maybe just turn into another slop churn down the pipeline. But if we can encourage those to tell more around those ideas of individuals growing around the world that they live in, and the ever-increased importance of family, especially in the realm of Disney that has lived on for over 100 years with Pixar adding the spice towards it, then I think this really could work. Wish I could have said more about this, but this is more of an open discussion for everyone to talk about and what that could mean for its future. And I'm all done now, so goodbye.